At 4:15 a.m. on January 12, 2025, Israeli defense systems registered something that stretched their capabilities beyond anything seen since October 7, 2023. Over 3,200 incoming projectiles appeared on radar screens across the nation, but these weren't the same rockets that had challenged the Iron Dome before. Longer-range rockets mixed with coordinated drone swarms created a sustained barrage that pushed Israel's defense network harder than the 2,200 rockets fired during the initial October attack. Within minutes, the most sophisticated defense system on Earth was adapting in real time to tactics that had evolved dramatically over just 16 months. The weapons being used and the methods of attack represented a fundamental shift in how this conflict was being fought. The new arsenal, how warfare evolved in 2 years. The evolution of military technology between October 2023 and January 2025 accelerated at a pace that caught defense analysts worldwide off guard. Palestinian militant groups gained access to more sophisticated weaponry than ever before, including Iranian-supplied Fateh series missiles with extended range capabilities that could reach targets across Israel in minutes rather than the hours required by previous rocket systems. These longer-range missiles followed less predictable flight paths, making traditional interception calculations significantly more challenging for existing defense systems. Drone technology emerged as perhaps the most game-changing development during this period. Palestinian forces began deploying coordinated drone swarms that could communicate with each other and adjust attack patterns based on defensive responses. These swarms represented a fundamental shift from individual drone strikes to coordinated multi-unit operations that could overwhelm defense systems through sheer numbers and tactical coordination. The drones demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond simple remote-controlled aircraft, showing signs of autonomous decision-making that allowed them to continue missions even when communication links were severed. Israel responded to these evolving threats by rapidly upgrading its defensive capabilities throughout 2024. The Iron Dome system received significant enhancements, including new interceptor designs and improved tracking algorithms specifically developed to counter the faster, more maneuverable threats they now faced. Israeli engineers also deployed laser-based defense systems at strategic locations, offering a new layer of protection that could engage multiple targets simultaneously at a fraction of the cost of traditional interceptor missiles. Urban warfare tactics transformed completely as both sides adapted to weapons that operated with unprecedented precision. Traditional military doctrine had always accounted for human reaction times and decision-making delays, but the new generation of weapons eliminated many of those factors. Palestinian forces began coordinating attacks using sophisticated timing that took advantage of defensive system recharge cycles and civilian movement patterns, creating attack windows that lasted only minutes. Cyber warfare capabilities became critical force multipliers throughout this period. Palestinian cyber units, reportedly trained by Iranian specialists, launched coordinated attacks against Israeli infrastructure that created synchronized blackouts during kinetic strikes. These cyber operations targeted power grids, emergency communication networks, and water treatment facilities with precise timing. Israeli cyber defense teams discovered malware embedded throughout civilian infrastructure that could disable hospital generators, school systems, and residential internet connections on command, remaining dormant until activated by specific trigger codes. The introduction of micro-drones added an assassination dimension that previous conflicts had never featured. These small devices could target specific individuals using facial recognition technology and wait in standby mode for extended periods before executing strikes. Israeli military personnel reported incidents where these micro-drones followed individual soldiers, learning their routines before attacking during vulnerable moments. Palestinian engineers developed variants that could embed themselves in structures and detonate when specific targets entered designated areas. Manufacturing capabilities evolved dramatically through the widespread adoption of 3D printing technology in confined territories. Hidden facilities throughout Gaza and the West Bank began producing weapon components that traditional manufacturing could never create in such restricted spaces. These printers used specialized materials to create rocket fins, drone chassis, and explosive device housings. The technology enabled rapid replacement of destroyed equipment and continuous adaptation of weapon designs based on battlefield performance, with intelligence reports indicating daily production of hundreds of components through distributed printing networks. The psychological impact of these technological advances extended far beyond traditional combat stress. Israeli civilians reported constant anxiety about surveillance and targeting capabilities that seemed to operate beyond human limitations, while Palestinian civilians faced the threat of precision strikes that arrived without warning. The accuracy of modern targeting created a new form of paranoia where any individual could become a specific target rather than potential collateral damage. Mental health professionals began documenting trauma patterns related to fighting against weapons systems that demonstrated inhuman precision and persistence. Traditional military formations became obsolete when facing swarm attacks that could adapt faster than human commanders could issue orders. Israeli Defense Force units discovered that standard dispersal tactics provided limited protection against systems that calculated optimal strike patterns in real time. Palestinian fighters learned that even heavily fortified positions offered reduced safety against the new generation of penetrating weapons. Both sides adapted by developing smaller, more mobile units that changed positions constantly and avoided predictable movement patterns. Electronic warfare capabilities expanded to include jamming systems designed to disrupt drone communications and guidance systems. However, the advanced weapons quickly adapted by switching to visual navigation and inertial guidance systems that functioned without external signals. This created an electronic arms race that accelerated throughout 2024, producing weapons systems that could operate independently of traditional communication networks. The integration of civilian technology into military applications reached unprecedented levels during this period. Palestinian forces modified commercial electronics into military control systems and converted civilian vehicles into mobile launch platforms. Israeli defense contractors repurposed industrial equipment for military applications. Social media platforms became intelligence gathering tools that both sides used to identify targets and coordinate operations. This technological convergence transformed the conflict into a testing ground for modern warfare innovations, where every tactical advantage faced immediate countermeasures and every defensive improvement met new offensive capabilities. The speed of this arms race meant that military commanders on both sides found themselves constantly adapting to threats that hadn't existed weeks earlier. As these new weapon systems proved their effectiveness in combat, defense operators across the region began to realize that their most trusted systems would face challenges unlike anything they had encountered before. Iron Dome under siege, when the unbreakable breaks. The January 12, 2025 attack would test these evolved capabilities against Israel's most trusted defensive system in ways that revealed fundamental limitations built into even the most advanced military technology. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Brennan stared at her command screen in the Iron Dome Control Center near Ashkelon as red dots multiplied across her display faster than she had ever witnessed. The timestamp read 4:17 a.m., and incoming threat indicators covered her screen in numbers that exceeded every training scenario her team had prepared for. After 14 years operating Israel's most celebrated defense system, Brennan recognized immediately that this coordinated barrage pushed the Iron Dome beyond its designed operational limits. The batteries under her command faced thousands of incoming projectiles within the first hour, transforming Israel's legendary shield into a desperate exercise in mathematical triage. The Iron Dome operates through calculations that determine defensive priorities in microseconds, but the system faces hard physical constraints that no amount of technological sophistication can overcome. Each battery contains interceptor launchers loaded with Tamir missiles, providing a finite number of shots before requiring reload sequences that consume critical minutes during active attacks. The system's radar networks track incoming projectiles at distances up to 70 kilometers, feeding trajectory data to battle management computers that calculate impact zones and assign interception priorities based on population density and strategic value. During sustained attacks, the system's computers execute triage protocols that automatically prioritize targets threatening densely populated areas while allowing lower priority projectiles to proceed unengaged. This mathematical approach to defense means that some areas receive protection while others face calculated abandonment based on algorithms that weigh civilian populations against available interceptor inventory. The January attack forced these systems to make such calculations at unprecedented scale and speed. The Iron Dome's effectiveness faces particular challenges when confronting the faster, more maneuverable projectiles that Palestinian forces deployed throughout 2024 and into 2025. Traditional radar tracking systems require minimum detection windows to calculate accurate interception trajectories, but the newer generation of rockets complete their flight paths faster than conventional tracking algorithms were designed to handle. These weapons create radar signatures that shift more rapidly than standard processing can accommodate, causing target locks to fail at crucial moments when interception calculations become most critical. Economic considerations add another layer of complexity to Iron Dome operations that military planners must factor into every defensive engagement. Each Tamir interceptor missile represents a significant financial investment, while the rockets targeting Israel cost substantially less to produce and deploy. This cost disparity means that extended bombardments can drain Israeli defense budgets faster than manufacturing can replenish interceptor stockpiles, creating strategic vulnerabilities that extend beyond immediate tactical concerns. The psychological burden on Iron Dome operators during mass attacks creates human factors that affect system performance in ways that pure technology cannot address. Operators monitor multiple screens simultaneously, tracking hundreds or thousands of threat indicators while knowing that every decision directly impacts civilian safety. During extended engagements, operators report decision fatigue as their screens display more targets than human minds can effectively process, forcing command staff to rotate personnel frequently to maintain operational effectiveness. Israel has responded to these challenges by developing complementary defense systems that address Iron Dome limitations. The Iron Beam laser-based platform represents one such innovation, offering theoretically unlimited shots without depleting missile inventory. However, laser systems require clear atmospheric conditions and can engage only single targets sequentially, creating their own operational constraints during heavy attacks. These backup systems provide additional defensive layers, but face similar mathematical limitations when confronting large-scale coordinated attacks. Drone swarms present unique challenges that exploit Iron Dome target identification systems in ways that traditional projectiles cannot. The system's computers categorize threats based on size, speed, and trajectory patterns established during years of rocket defense operations. Modern drone swarms intentionally alter these parameters mid-flight, changing formation patterns and flight characteristics to trigger classification errors that can waste interceptor missiles on phantom targets while actual threats proceed unengaged. Technicians working inside Iron Dome installations during active attacks perform critical maintenance and recalibration tasks under extreme conditions. These specialists replace damaged components, reset overheated systems, and reload interceptor magazines while their facilities shake from nearby explosions and interceptor launches. Real-time system modifications often improve interception rates significantly, but require expertise and split-second decision-making that pushes human capabilities to their limits. The reality of Iron Dome operations during major attacks reveals that even the most sophisticated defense systems cannot provide absolute protection against determined, well-coordinated assaults. The system consistently adapts to new threats and has successfully intercepted thousands of projectiles over its operational history, but faces fundamental constraints when projectile volumes exceed interceptor capacity and tracking capabilities. Success becomes measured not in perfect protection, but in damage limitation and casualty reduction. The mathematical certainty that some attacks will penetrate even the most advanced defenses transforms modern warfare into exercises where technological superiority provides advantages rather than guarantees. The human cost of these limitations extends far beyond the immediate tactical implications of any single engagement. The human cost, 2025's casualty statistics revealed. The documented casualties from this escalating conflict paint a stark picture of modern warfare's human toll. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, over 61,700 Palestinians have died since October 2023, with the majority being civilians, including women and children. Israeli casualties have reached approximately 1,200 deaths, representing the highest loss of life in decades of conflict between these populations. These numbers continue climbing daily as military operations intensify across contested territories, creating a humanitarian crisis that extends far beyond immediate combat zones. The nature of injuries sustained during the 2025 escalation reflects the devastating impact of advanced weapons systems on human bodies. Medical professionals treating casualties report trauma patterns that overwhelm existing treatment protocols and exhaust hospital resources at unprecedented rates. Palestinian medical facilities, already operating under severe constraints, face impossible choices about which patients receive life-saving care when supplies run critically low. Israeli trauma centers process casualties requiring complex surgical procedures that consume enormous resources and specialized expertise. Gaza's medical infrastructure has reached the breaking point, with the United Nations warning of a complete public health catastrophe. Of the territory's 36 hospitals, the vast majority have suffered significant damage that reduces their operational capacity, while several facilities remain completely non-functional. Medical staff work under constant threat conditions, performing emergency surgeries without adequate supplies or reliable power sources. The destruction of medical facilities creates cascading effects where treatable injuries become fatal due to delayed or unavailable care. Emergency response capabilities on both sides face severe limitations that directly impact casualty outcomes. Palestinian ambulance crews navigate destroyed roads and active combat zones to reach wounded civilians, often arriving too late to prevent deaths that proper medical intervention could have avoided. Israeli emergency services operate under persistent threat conditions that force frequent evacuations and equipment relocations, disrupting normal response procedures. The average response time for emergency medical assistance has increased significantly compared to pre-conflict periods, contributing to higher mortality rates among the wounded. Children represent a disproportionate percentage of casualties, reflecting the conflict's impact on civilian populations concentrated in residential areas. Palestinian families living in densely populated neighborhoods face particular vulnerability when military operations target residential buildings. Israeli communities near border areas experience trauma that affects entire family networks across multiple generations. The psychological impact on surviving children creates long-term mental health challenges that will require treatment for years beyond active combat operations. Documentation of casualties has become increasingly complex as both sides utilize social media platforms to broadcast real-time accounts of attacks and their aftermath. Palestinian civilians share footage of destroyed homes and wounded family members, creating visual evidence that influences international perception of the conflict's human cost. Israeli families document hospital visits and funeral services, personalizing abstract casualty statistics through individual stories that generate emotional responses worldwide. These platforms also spread conflicting information about casualty numbers and attack circumstances, complicating accurate record-keeping efforts. International humanitarian organizations struggle to provide adequate medical assistance due to security restrictions and funding limitations. United Nations relief agencies report severe shortfalls in medical supply deliveries, meeting only a fraction of identified needs in affected areas. International medical volunteers cannot access treatment facilities in Gaza due to ongoing military operations, while specialized equipment shipments face inspection delays that render time-sensitive medical supplies ineffective upon arrival. Pharmaceutical supply chains face disruptions that create shortages of medications essential for trauma surgery and post-operative care. The economic burden of treating modern weapon injuries creates financial pressures that affect both healthcare systems for decades beyond active conflict periods. Israeli medical insurance systems process unprecedented claims for treatments requiring specialized equipment and extended rehabilitation services. Palestinian medical facilities operate without adequate funding to purchase equipment needed for treating severe trauma cases, creating treatment disparities based on economic resources rather than medical necessity. Brain injury rehabilitation requires technologies and expertise that cost enormous sums, limiting access to proper care for many survivors. Treatment protocols developed for injuries sustained during this conflict establish medical precedents that influence trauma care practices globally. Doctors treating casualties discover that conventional medical approaches prove inadequate against injuries caused by modern weapon systems. Surgeons develop new techniques for addressing trauma patterns that occur at multiple organ system levels simultaneously. These medical innovations emerge from treating injuries specifically designed to overwhelm treatment capabilities while maximizing long-term disability among survivors. The casualty statistics from 2025 represent more than numerical measurements of human loss. They document the devastating impact of advanced weapon systems on civilian populations and reveal how modern conflicts create humanitarian crises that extend far beyond immediate combat zones. As military operations continue reshaping the physical landscape of contested areas, the human cost grows daily, creating challenges that will affect both societies for generations to come. The territorial control that emerges from these operations carries consequences that reach every aspect of civilian life in ways that previous conflicts never achieved. Territory and control, the new map of conflict. Military operations across these contested areas have fundamentally redrawn territorial boundaries, creating a fragmented landscape where control shifts based on tactical advantages and strategic priorities. Israeli Defense Forces now occupy significant portions of northern Gaza, displacing approximately 90% of the population and establishing buffer zones that extend several kilometers inland from the coastline. These military positions encompass all border crossings with Egypt, effectively transforming the remaining Palestinian-controlled areas into isolated enclaves surrounded by Israeli checkpoints and secured corridors. The strategic importance of captured territories reveals calculated efforts to control population movement and essential infrastructure rather than simple land acquisition. Israeli forces prioritize locations that provide oversight of water treatment facilities, electrical substations, and telecommunications networks serving Palestinian civilian populations. Control of these installations allows military commanders to regulate essential services during tactical operations. The Rafah crossing area holds particular significance because it represents Gaza's primary connection to the outside world beyond Israeli territory, making its control essential for maintaining oversight of Palestinian movement and supply lines. Hamas has utilized an extensive tunnel network to move fighters and supplies beneath Gaza's surface, creating underground command centers that span significant portions of the territory. These tunnel systems feature multiple levels with passages running deep enough to resist conventional munitions, equipped with air filtration systems and secure communication networks. The tunnels include access points that allow movement of equipment and personnel without surface exposure, though Israeli military operations have destroyed substantial portions of this infrastructure in areas like Rafah and Khan Yunis. Urban warfare in densely populated areas transforms civilian neighborhoods into military battlegrounds where traditional engagement rules become impossible to maintain. Palestinian fighters utilize residential buildings as firing positions and weapon storage sites, while Israeli forces respond with precision strikes targeting military objectives within civilian structures. The high population density in contested urban areas means that every military action affects hundreds of civilian residents who cannot evacuate due to transportation restrictions and security cordons. Combat operations in these environments require specialized tactics designed for room-to-room fighting in structures containing both armed combatants and civilian families. Civilian populations have become unwilling participants in territorial battles through their integration into military strategies employed by both sides. Palestinian families receive instructions to report Israeli troop movements and provide shelter for fighters operating in their neighborhoods. Israeli civilians living in border communities serve as early warning systems for incoming attacks and provide intelligence about infiltration attempts. These involvement patterns create complications under international humanitarian law, as traditional distinctions between combatants and non-combatants become increasingly difficult to maintain during sustained urban combat operations. Technology enables remote monitoring and control of territory through sensor networks and automated surveillance systems that operate continuously without requiring human personnel in forward positions. Israeli forces deploy ground sensors along infiltration routes that detect movement patterns and transmit real-time alerts to command centers located behind defensive lines. Palestinian technical units install hidden cameras and listening devices throughout contested areas to monitor Israeli patrol schedules and communications. Drone surveillance provides constant overhead monitoring of territorial boundaries, allowing both sides to track movements and coordinate responses without exposing personnel to direct combat risks. International borders have been affected by the expanded conflict as military operations extend into Egyptian and Lebanese territory through cross-border activities and attacks targeting locations outside the immediate combat zone. Egyptian security forces have discovered numerous tunnel entrances along the Rafah border, indicating underground networks that bypass official crossing points. Lebanese border areas experience frequent bombardments as Israeli forces target positions supporting Palestinian militants. These cross-border operations create diplomatic tensions with neighboring countries and complicate international efforts to contain the conflict within its original geographical boundaries. Economic impact on local populations intensifies as territorial instability destroys agricultural land, commercial districts, and industrial facilities that provided employment before the conflict escalation. Palestinian farmers cannot access significant portions of their agricultural land due to security restrictions and active combat operations in rural areas. Small businesses throughout Gaza and southern Israel remain closed because their locations fall within military operation zones or lack reliable utilities. Unemployment rates in contested territories reach extreme levels as normal economic activity becomes impossible under constant security threats and movement restrictions. Humanitarian aid delivery faces enormous challenges in contested zones where aid workers cannot guarantee safe passage, and distribution points frequently become military targets. International relief organizations require military escorts to reach Palestinian communities, but these escorts make aid convoys appear as legitimate military targets to opposing forces. Aid supplies accumulate at border crossings for extended periods, while security inspections verify that shipments contain no materials that could support military operations. Medical supplies and food deliveries often reach intended recipients well past expiration dates due to inspection delays and transportation security requirements. The conflict has created refugee populations exceeding 1.8 million displaced persons who require emergency shelter and basic services that overwhelmed humanitarian systems cannot provide adequately. These refugees concentrate in temporary camps that lack proper sanitation facilities, medical care, and educational resources for displaced children. Many families move multiple times as combat operations shift territorial control, and previously safe areas become active battlegrounds. Displacement patterns show that families with economic resources evacuate contested areas early, while impoverished populations remain trapped because they cannot afford transportation or temporary housing in safer locations. These territorial changes and population displacements create facts on the ground that will influence future negotiations regardless of formal political agreements. The scale and coordination required for such extensive military operations raises questions about how such comprehensive planning could proceed without detection by intelligence agencies, the intelligence war tasked with monitoring these exact scenarios. Israeli intelligence agencies faced their most serious operational failure in decades when Hamas launched its coordinated attack on October 7, 2023, catching Mossad and other security services completely off guard despite extensive surveillance capabilities. The former chief of Mossad later admitted that the organization had zero advanced knowledge of the attack, describing the intelligence lapse as unprecedented in the agency's history. This failure occurred despite Hamas conducting extensive preparations involving thousands of fighters, over 5,000 rockets, and sophisticated logistical coordination that should have generated detectable intelligence signatures across multiple collection systems. The scale of Hamas's preparations required substantial infrastructure development, weapons stockpiling, and training operations that involved significant numbers of personnel over extended periods. Intelligence analysts who had built careers on monitoring Palestinian militant capabilities found themselves blindsided by coordination networks and weapons systems that exceeded their threat assessments. The attack preparations included tunnel construction, rocket manufacturing, fighter training, and communications coordination that operated for months without triggering Israeli intelligence alerts or generating actionable warnings from human sources within Palestinian territories. Hamas employed sophisticated operational security measures that effectively neutralized Israeli surveillance capabilities throughout the planning period. The organization compartmentalized information among different operational units, used multiple communication channels to avoid pattern recognition, and likely exploited vulnerabilities in Israeli monitoring systems that focused on traditional threat indicators. Palestinian forces developed supply chains and command structures that operated outside established surveillance parameters, while Israeli intelligence concentrated on known weapons smuggling routes and recognized militant leaders. The timing of the attack demonstrated strategic planning that exploited both symbolic significance and operational advantages. Hamas launched the assault on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War during a Jewish holiday, deliberately choosing a moment when Israeli alertness might be reduced. The attack coincided with internal Israeli political divisions and government efforts that may have contributed to decreased readiness within security apparatus. This timing, combined with the complete surprise achieved by Hamas, created maximum psychological impact while providing tactical advantages during the initial assault phases. Intelligence collection priorities had emphasized monitoring traditional rocket production facilities and tunnel construction activities, but missed sophisticated weapons assembly operations conducted in civilian workshops and private residences throughout Gaza. The failure extended to human intelligence networks that failed to recruit sources within Palestinian technical units responsible for advanced weapons development and coordination planning. Israeli agencies focused on established threat patterns while Hamas developed entirely new operational methodologies specifically designed to avoid detection by conventional surveillance techniques. The intelligence breakdown revealed systematic blind spots in Israeli surveillance methodologies that Palestinian strategists exploited with devastating effectiveness. Mossad analysts concentrated on familiar indicators and known threat vectors, while Hamas created operational frameworks that functioned outside traditional intelligence collection parameters. The organization successfully concealed weapons testing, training exercises, and logistics coordination involving thousands of personnel while maintaining complete operational security against some of the world's most sophisticated intelligence organizations. Post-attack analysis revealed that Palestinian forces had maintained secure communications and coordination capabilities that rendered Israeli signal intelligence collection efforts ineffective throughout the preparation period. Hamas utilized communication security measures that created undetectable coordination pathways, allowing commanders to manage complex operations without generating interceptable intelligence. The successful concealment of such extensive preparations demonstrated fundamental weaknesses in traditional surveillance methodologies when facing adversaries who understand and actively counter established intelligence collection techniques. The failure had cascading effects throughout Israeli intelligence operations, forcing complete re-evaluation of threat assessment procedures and collection priorities. Intelligence agencies discovered that their focus on conventional threats had created vulnerabilities that Hamas exploited through unconventional planning and execution. Methods. The organization's ability to coordinate such extensive operations while avoiding detection highlighted the limitations of technology-dependent intelligence gathering when confronting adversaries who employ sophisticated counterintelligence techniques. International intelligence sharing arrangements provided no advance warning of the attack, with United States agencies confirming they possessed no prior knowledge of Hamas preparations. This lack of international intelligence support compounded the Israeli failure and demonstrated that even extensive intelligence cooperation networks could not compensate for fundamental collection and analysis shortcomings. The complete absence of warning indicators across multiple intelligence systems revealed coordination failures that extended beyond individual agency limitations. The extent of advanced planning that remained hidden from elite intelligence agencies exposed the evolving nature of modern conflict where traditional surveillance advantages face unprecedented challenges. Hamas demonstrated that determined adversaries could conduct extensive military preparations while maintaining operational security against sophisticated intelligence organizations through careful planning and advanced security measures. The successful concealment of such comprehensive attack preparations forced intelligence agencies worldwide to reconsider their capabilities and methodologies when confronting adversaries who specifically design operations to defeat established surveillance techniques. This intelligence failure created immediate concerns about regional stability as neighboring governments struggled to assess the implications of such sophisticated attack capabilities appearing without warning. The demonstration that extensive military preparations could proceed undetected raised questions about similar threats that might be developing elsewhere in the region, forcing diplomatic and security officials across the Middle East to urgently reevaluate their own intelligence assessments and regional threat calculations. Regional powers react. The Middle East holds its breath. Saudi Arabia immediately suspended its normalization talks with Israel in solidarity with Gaza, while Egypt reinforced its border and engaged in urgent mediation efforts to prevent regional escalation. Within hours of the attacks, foreign ministries across the Middle East convened emergency sessions as regional powers struggled to calibrate their responses to a conflict that threatened to destabilize the entire region. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi called for an immediate ceasefire and expanded United Nations involvement while simultaneously reaching out to both Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas through back-channel diplomatic contacts. Jordan's King Abdullah II activated the kingdom's crisis management protocols and began coordinating with international partners to prevent spillover violence that could threaten his own territory's stability. Saudi Arabia's carefully orchestrated normalization discussions with Israel, which had progressed steadily throughout 2024, collapsed as domestic political pressure made continued negotiations impossible. The kingdom's religious establishment issued statements condemning Israeli military actions while demanding immediate suspension of all diplomatic contacts with Tel Aviv. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who had personally championed the normalization process as part of his Vision 2030 economic transformation plan, found himself politically constrained by popular opinion that viewed continued Israeli engagement as betrayal of Palestinian suffering. The Saudi government officially announced the indefinite postponement of normalization talks, citing the need for immediate ceasefire and Palestinian humanitarian relief as preconditions for any future diplomatic progress. The Abraham Accords framework, which had facilitated unprecedented cooperation between Israel and Arab nations, faces existential challenges as participating countries reassess their commitments under current circumstances. The United Arab Emirates maintains official diplomatic relations with Israel while quietly providing humanitarian aid to Palestinian refugees through international organizations. Bahrain's government issues pro-Palestinian statements for domestic consumption while continuing intelligence cooperation with Israeli security services to combat shared terrorism threats. Morocco suspended several joint military exercises with Israel but maintains trade relationships that generate significant economic benefits for both countries. These Arab nations attempt to balance competing pressures by supporting Palestinian humanitarian needs while avoiding actions that could trigger Israeli retaliation or destabilize their own territories. Iran's expanded role in supplying advanced weapons technology to Palestinian forces represents the most significant escalation of proxy warfare capabilities in Middle Eastern history, transforming regional power dynamics in ways that neighboring countries struggle to comprehend or counter. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps established training facilities in Syria where Palestinian technicians learned to operate advanced weapons systems before returning to Gaza with expertise that enabled the coordinated attacks. Iranian military advisors remain embedded within Palestinian command structures, providing real-time tactical support and strategic guidance that multiplies the effectiveness of supplied weapons. This direct Iranian involvement transforms the conflict from a localized Palestinian-Israeli dispute into a regional confrontation that threatens to involve multiple state actors. Regional oil markets experienced immediate volatility as traders anticipated potential disruption of shipping routes through the Red Sea and Suez Canal that handle significant portions of global petroleum exports. Crude oil prices jumped substantially in the first week following the escalation as Houthi rebels in Yemen launched missile attacks against commercial vessels transiting strategic waterways. Saudi Arabia increased production capacity to offset potential supply disruptions while simultaneously coordinating with other Gulf states to maintain stable pricing mechanisms. The economic impact extends beyond oil markets as regional trade routes face security threats that increase shipping insurance costs and force cargo vessels to utilize longer alternative routes that add weeks to delivery schedules. Proxy forces operating throughout the region complicate diplomatic relationships as governments struggle to control non-state actors who pursue independent agendas that conflict with official state policies. Hezbollah forces in Lebanon launch periodic rocket attacks against Israeli positions despite Lebanese government efforts to maintain neutrality and prevent escalation on their territory. Iraqi militia groups backed by Iran attack American military installations in response to perceived United States support for Israeli operations, forcing the Iraqi government to navigate between Iranian pressure and American security partnerships. Syrian government forces allow Iranian weapons shipments to transit their territory while officially denying involvement in Palestinian military support operations. Neighboring countries face humanitarian challenges that strain their resources and create domestic political pressures as refugee populations exceed their capacity to provide adequate assistance. Jordan hosts substantial numbers of new Palestinian refugees who crossed the border during the escalation, overwhelming existing refugee camps and requiring emergency international assistance. Egypt struggles to manage displaced Palestinians who entered through the Rafah crossing before security concerns forced its closure, creating a humanitarian crisis that Egyptian authorities cannot address without significant international support. Lebanon faces additional strain as Palestinian refugees join existing Syrian refugee populations that already burden the country's limited social services and economic resources. These shifting regional alignments reflect deeper changes in Middle Eastern power structures as traditional alliances face unprecedented pressure from expanding conflict. The crisis forces governments throughout the region to choose between historical relationships and immediate security concerns, creating new diplomatic configurations that may persist long after active combat operations conclude. As regional powers continue adapting their strategies to address this evolving crisis, the conflict's impact extends far beyond the immediate combat zones, reshaping the physical and political landscape across contested territories. The urban battlefield, Gaza's transformation into a fortress. The physical transformation of Gaza itself reveals how modern urban warfare adapts civilian environments for military purposes in ways that complicate traditional combat operations. Gaza's urban landscape now serves dual purposes where civilian structures integrate military functions, making it nearly impossible to distinguish between legitimate targets and protected civilian infrastructure. Residential buildings house both families and military equipment, while commercial areas contain both legitimate businesses and weapons storage facilities. This integration forces military planners to navigate complex targeting decisions where destroying military capabilities requires attacking locations that serve essential civilian functions. Urban combat in Gaza has forced Palestinian militants to embed military operations within civilian infrastructure throughout the territory's densely populated areas. The challenge of distinguishing military targets from civilian structures becomes impossible when the same buildings serve both purposes. Simultaneously, apartment complexes house families while also serving as weapon storage locations, creating targeting dilemmas that complicate military decision-making processes. Medical facilities treat wounded civilians while potentially serving as meeting locations for military coordination. Schools operate educational programs while their buildings may contain communication equipment or serve other military functions. This dual-use integration creates environments where civilian and military activities occur in identical locations throughout Gaza's urban areas. The tunnel networks beneath Gaza represent sophisticated underground infrastructure that spans significant portions of the territory. These tunnels serve multiple military functions, including troop movement, weapons storage, and command coordination, while remaining largely hidden from surface surveillance. The underground passages connect various locations throughout Gaza, allowing military operations to continue even when surface activities face restrictions. Israeli military operations have targeted and destroyed substantial portions of this tunnel infrastructure, particularly in areas like Rafah and Khan Yunis, but significant networks reportedly remain operational in other sectors. Gaza's civilian population has adapted to living in a permanent military zone through survival strategies that affect every aspect of daily life. Families develop routines around military activities occurring in their neighborhoods, timing essential activities like grocery shopping and school attendance to avoid conflicts with ongoing operations. Children learn to recognize aircraft sounds and explosion types to determine appropriate shelter responses during attacks. Adults coordinate household schedules around military activities that may affect their buildings or neighborhoods. These civilian adaptations create complex relationships between military operations and civilian life that make evacuation difficult even when safe passage opportunities become available. The logistics of supplying military equipment to a besieged territory require innovative approaches that utilize civilian transportation systems and commercial supply chains. Advanced weapons components must enter Gaza through inspection checkpoints designed to prevent military supplies from reaching Palestinian forces. The complete siege imposed by Israel blocks entry of most goods, including electricity, water, food, and fuel, creating severe shortages that affect both civilian and military operations. Deliveries through the Rafah crossing with Egypt amount to only a small fraction of Gaza's normal supply requirements and exclude fuel shipments that power essential infrastructure. These supply restrictions create conditions where both civilian and military operations face severe resource constraints. Urban warfare tactics in Gaza's dense architectural environment maximize defensive advantages available through building-to-building movement and concealed positions. Palestinian fighters utilize existing structures to avoid detection while maintaining operational capabilities against Israeli forces conducting ground operations. The dense urban environment provides natural cover and concealment that complicates conventional military operations designed for more open terrain. Communication networks utilize existing civilian infrastructure to coordinate activities while avoiding detection by electronic warfare systems. These tactics transform neighborhoods into potential battlefields where civilian structures provide tactical advantages that conventional weapons cannot easily overcome. The psychological impact on civilians creates permanent trauma conditions that affect mental health across entire communities living within militarized urban environments. Children develop anxiety disorders related to constant aircraft noise and explosion, sounds that interrupt sleep patterns and educational activities. Adults experience chronic stress from uncertainty about whether their homes or neighborhoods will become targets during routine daily activities. Families face impossible choices between evacuating to potentially safer areas or remaining in familiar environments where they understand local survival protocols. Mental health services cannot adequately address trauma levels affecting populations where military conflict represents permanent rather than temporary living conditions. International humanitarian law faces unprecedented challenges when civilian infrastructure serves dual military and civilian purposes throughout densely populated urban areas. The Geneva Conventions require protection of civilian facilities, but these protections become complicated when the same structures serve military functions. Both Israeli and Palestinian forces face accusations of violating international humanitarian law through targeting decisions and operational methods that affect civilian populations. The International Criminal Court has announced applications for arrest warrants against leaders from both sides, though enforcement remains uncertain. The transformation of Gaza into a militarized urban environment demonstrates how modern conflicts create conditions where traditional distinctions between military and civilian targets become impossible to maintain. This urban warfare model presents tactical and legal challenges that extend far beyond the immediate conflict zone, creating precedents that military strategists and legal experts worldwide must analyze and understand. The lessons emerging from Gaza's urban battlefield are reshaping how military professionals approach similar environments globally. Global implications: how this conflict rewrites modern warfare. Military strategists worldwide now study the Gaza conflict as a defining moment that demonstrates how advanced technologies can reshape warfare fundamentals in ways that traditional military doctrine never anticipated. The conflict has become a major reference point for defense planners globally, influencing military budgets and development priorities as nations recognize that future conflicts will require capabilities demonstrated during this escalation. Countries across multiple continents have initiated urgent reviews of their defense strategies, with particular focus on missile defense systems and drone technologies that proved decisive during the fighting. The international arms trade experienced significant shifts as governments worldwide sought capabilities similar to those employed during the conflict. Nations that previously focused on conventional military hardware began placing orders for advanced air defense systems, sophisticated drone platforms, and electronic warfare capabilities. Iran received numerous inquiries from countries seeking access to missile technologies, while Israeli defense contractors faced unprecedented demand for Iron Dome components and related defensive systems. The conflict demonstrated that smaller nations could potentially challenge larger military powers through advanced technologies rather than traditional force structures. Defense spending priorities transformed globally as military establishments recognized that technological capabilities would determine future conflict outcomes more than conventional force sizes. Countries began reallocating military budgets toward electronic warfare systems, autonomous platforms, and artificial intelligence applications rather than traditional heavy weapons and large personnel numbers. Military academies incorporated lessons from the Gaza conflict into their curricula, recognizing that the weapons and tactics employed represented emerging warfare models rather than isolated regional innovations. The conflict spurred international debates about future warfare doctrines and the potential for arms races in autonomous weapons systems. Military planners observe how artificial intelligence applications perform during complex combat scenarios, leading to expanded research programs focused on AI integration in military decision-making processes. The successful coordination of multiple weapon systems through automated processes demonstrated capabilities that human operators could not match, forcing defense establishments to reconsider fundamental assumptions about command and control structures. International humanitarian law faced unprecedented challenges as weapons systems operated beyond existing legal frameworks designed for human-controlled military operations. The International Committee of the Red Cross convened emergency sessions to address autonomous weapons that could select and engage targets without direct human authorization, creating legal precedents that traditional warfare regulations never anticipated. United Nations legal experts struggled to assign responsibility for civilian casualties caused by systems that made targeting decisions independently of human operators, requiring extensive reinterpretation of existing international agreements. Global security alliances experienced strain as member nations pursued different approaches to advanced weapons development and deployment policies. Traditional military cooperation frameworks required renegotiation to address how autonomous systems would affect alliance obligations and mutual defense commitments. Regional security partnerships reconsidered cooperation agreements as countries developed capabilities that could potentially threaten neighboring states through weapon systems that operated faster than diplomatic communication channels. Economic stability suffered globally as the conflict demonstrated how localized wars using advanced technologies could disrupt international trade and energy markets far beyond their geographical boundaries. Shipping insurance rates increased substantially for vessels transiting regions where precision-guided weapons proved capable of targeting commercial traffic. Global supply chains adapted to avoid areas where autonomous systems might mistake civilian cargo for military supplies, creating new transportation costs and delivery delays that affected international commerce. Humanitarian organizations developed new protocols for operating in environments where advanced weapon systems might identify relief workers as legitimate targets based on movement patterns or equipment signatures. Medical facilities adopted identification systems designed to communicate their protected status to automated weapons using electronic signals that artificial intelligence systems could recognize and respect. International humanitarian agencies established emergency response procedures for conflicts involving weapons that could continue attacking after human operators intended to cease fire. The conflict established precedents for civilian protection in warfare featuring autonomous weapons and AI-integrated targeting systems. Relief organizations recognized that future conflicts would require completely different operational approaches when facing weapon systems that could make targeting decisions without human oversight. These precedents influenced how humanitarian agencies prepared for similar conflicts while establishing new standards for civilian protection in technologically advanced warfare environments. The Gaza conflict provided a comprehensive demonstration of how cutting-edge technologies could integrate with traditional military objectives to fundamentally alter defense planning and military strategy. Small nations recognized that advanced technologies could provide military advantages previously available only to superpowers, while major military powers understood that conventional superiority offered limited protection against enemies equipped with sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities and autonomous systems. The successful integration of multiple advanced weapons systems during sustained combat operations established a template that military establishments worldwide could not ignore. The conflict forced defense planners to reconsider their fundamental assumptions about combat operations and strategic planning, recognizing that future wars would require completely different capabilities and approaches than those developed during previous decades of military experience. The intensity of combat operations created conditions where theoretical weapons concepts required immediate practical application, accelerating development processes that would normally require years of peacetime innovation born from desperation. Combat necessity fueled rapid technological innovation throughout 2025, transforming the conflict into a comprehensive testing ground for experimental weapons systems that accelerated military development at unprecedented speeds. Both Israeli and Palestinian forces adapted existing technologies for immediate battlefield deployment, eliminating traditional development timelines and safety protocols that normally required years of peacetime research. The pressure of daily attacks created an environment where theoretical weapons concepts entered combat operations immediately after basic functionality testing, providing real-world performance data that no laboratory could simulate. Palestinian engineers developed sophisticated weapons systems in underground workshops using commercially available components, operating under constant threat of Israeli airstrikes that forced technicians to complete complex assembly procedures in facilities that could be destroyed at any moment. These workshops transformed consumer electronics into military applications through creative engineering that utilized smartphone processors, commercial camera modules, and battery systems originally designed for civilian use. Israeli defense contractors responded by establishing rapid prototyping facilities that produced new interceptor designs in 6-week cycles, testing prototypes against live incoming threats rather than simulated targets. The conflict served as a live testing environment for weapon systems that military contractors worldwide studied to evaluate future combat effectiveness. Israeli iron beam laser systems received their first extensive field testing against diverse threat types under conditions that no laboratory could replicate, while Palestinian autonomous weapons provided real-world performance data for targeting algorithms that had previously existed only in computer simulations. International observers collected comprehensive performance data from both successful and failed weapon deployments, creating databases that informed global military development programs and established new benchmarks for weapons effectiveness under actual combat conditions. International technology suppliers played crucial roles in accelerating innovation by providing components and expertise that neither side could develop independently within required timeframes. Iranian technical advisors brought specialized knowledge, while electronics manufacturers supplied processors capable of handling complex calculations at speeds necessary for autonomous weapons operation. American defense contractors provided Israeli forces with experimental interceptor technologies that had not completed traditional testing protocols, allowing combat evaluation of systems still in development phases. European companies supplied dual-use components that served civilian purposes while enabling military applications, creating supply chains that operated in legal gray areas where international sanctions proved difficult to enforce. Rapid technological development consistently outpaced international regulatory frameworks designed to control weapons proliferation and establish ethical boundaries for military innovation. New weapons entered combat operations months before international bodies could analyze their implications or develop appropriate control mechanisms. The United Nations struggled to classify autonomous weapons within existing arms control treaties that assumed human decision-making in targeting processes, while traditional export control regimes proved inadequate for regulating technologies that could be adapted for military purposes through software modifications rather than hardware changes. The economic costs of maintaining technological superiority during prolonged conflict created unsustainable financial burdens that affected long-term military planning and resource allocation. Israeli defense spending increased substantially to fund continuous interceptor missile production and laser system deployment, while Palestinian forces allocated the majority of available resources to weapons development and acquisition programs. The rapid obsolescence of military systems forced both sides to maintain parallel development programs for current and next-generation weapons simultaneously, with traditional military procurement budgets proving inadequate for conflicts where technological advantages disappeared within months. Technological advantages shifted the balance of power in real time as new capabilities emerged and were countered by opposing innovations within weeks or months of deployment. Palestinian-guided systems initially achieve high success rates against Israeli defenses until adaptive countermeasures reduced their effectiveness, while Israeli laser systems provided temporary advantages until Palestinian forces deployed countermeasures that negated targeting capabilities. The rapid pace of technological change meant that strategic advantages lasted only briefly before countermeasures restored approximate parity between opposing forces, creating continuous instability where neither side could establish lasting superiority through any single innovation. The conflict established a new model for rapid military innovation that other nations studied as a template for accelerating their own defense development programs. Military planners worldwide recognize that future conflicts would require technological adaptation capabilities rather than large inventories of standardized weapons systems. The integration of civilian technology into military applications demonstrated cost-effective approaches to weapons development that smaller nations could implement without massive defense industrial investments, while compressed development timelines proved that emergency conditions could eliminate bureaucratic obstacles that normally slowed military innovation. This technological arms race created precedents that extended far beyond the immediate combat zone, influencing military development priorities and defense spending patterns across multiple continents. The successful deployment of experimental systems under combat conditions provided validation for concepts that traditional military establishments had considered too risky or unproven for operational use. As these innovations proved their battlefield effectiveness, governments worldwide began reassessing their own military capabilities and strategic relationships, recognizing that the technological developments emerging from this conflict would reshape international security considerations for decades to come. International response: the world chooses sides. Major powers moved quickly to choose sides as the escalating conflict forced governments worldwide to abandon neutral positions and declare explicit support for either Israeli or Palestinian positions. The United States Congress approved an emergency $8.7 billion aid package for Israel, including funding for Iron Dome interceptor missiles and advanced defensive systems that had proven essential during the sustained attacks. American military transport aircraft delivered weapon shipments to Israeli bases, while Pentagon officials established enhanced coordination channels to provide real-time military assistance. Iran confirmed its backing of Palestinian militants through increased weapons deliveries and technical support, utilizing sophisticated supply networks that avoided detection by Israeli naval patrols. European Union foreign ministers abandoned their usual consensus-building approach as member nations issued competing statements within hours of the attacks. Germany provided diplomatic support for Israeli defensive actions, while Ireland condemned what they termed disproportionate military responses against Palestinian civilians. France suspended certain military cooperation agreements with Israel while maintaining intelligence sharing arrangements, creating contradictory policies that reflected internal political divisions. The United Kingdom faced cabinet-level disagreements that led to conflicting public statements, undermining British diplomatic effectiveness in international forums, attempting to mediate between opposing parties. China announced official neutrality while simultaneously expanding economic relationships with Iran that included dual-use technologies potentially applicable to military systems. Russia provided diplomatic cover for Palestinian actions at the United Nations Security Council while sharing intelligence about Israeli military movements with regional allies. These major power positions reflected deeper geopolitical competition rather than purely humanitarian concerns, with each nation calculating strategic advantages based on regional influence and alliance relationships. United Nations institutions struggled to respond effectively as Permanent Security Council members pursued competing objectives that paralyzed international intervention efforts. Russia and China blocked multiple resolutions calling for ceasefires and humanitarian corridors, while the United States prevented resolutions condemning Israeli military actions and demanding immediate withdrawal from occupied territories. Secretary General Antonio Guterres stressed the risk of further escalation and emphasized the danger to civilians, but faced institutional limitations that prevented meaningful action when major powers disagreed fundamentally about conflict resolution approaches. The General Assembly passed non-binding resolutions by overwhelming majorities, but these symbolic victories provided no practical mechanisms for ending violence or protecting civilian populations. The United Nations reported that nearly 1.4 million people were displaced in the Gaza Strip, with nearly 600,000 sheltering in UNRWA facilities under increasingly difficult conditions. Humanitarian aid delivery faced severe restrictions, with supplies entering through the Rafah crossing amounting to no more than 4% of the daily average volume of commodities that entered Gaza before hostilities began. The lack of fuel crippled hospitals and essential services throughout the territory, creating a humanitarian crisis that international organizations struggled to address due to security constraints and political obstacles. International trade suffered disruptions that extended far beyond the immediate conflict zone as shipping companies rerouted cargo vessels to avoid potential attacks on commercial traffic. Maritime insurance rates increased substantially for vessels transiting the Eastern Mediterranean, while global supply chains adapted to avoid components manufactured in regions supporting either side of the conflict. Energy markets remained volatile as traders anticipated potential expansion of conflict to oil-producing regions, creating economic uncertainties that affected international commerce and investment patterns. The Abraham Accords, which had normalized relations between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco, experienced significant strain as societal-level contacts diminished and business relationships cooled. The UAE and Israel established a new land route across Saudi Arabia and Jordan that allowed Israeli companies to bypass Red Sea shipping lanes threatened by attacks from Yemen, demonstrating adaptive economic cooperation despite political tensions. However, the overall impact on trade relationships remained negative, with many joint projects placed on hold indefinitely. Saudi Arabia's potential normalization with Israel faced new complications as the kingdom demanded substantial progress on Palestinian issues as a precondition for any future diplomatic agreements. The conflict effectively suspended normalization discussions that had progressed steadily throughout 2024, forcing Saudi leadership to balance domestic political pressure with strategic economic interests. Other Arab nations found themselves navigating similar tensions between public support for Palestinian causes and practical relationships with Israeli partners. Domestic politics in supporting nations experienced significant impacts as ethnic and religious communities pressured governments to adopt more aggressive positions reflecting their cultural loyalties. American constituencies increased political engagement around Middle Eastern policy issues, while European governments faced mass demonstrations that reflected deep divisions within their populations. Political parties throughout democratic nations struggled to maintain coalition unity when members held incompatible positions on conflict resolution and military support policies. The conflict split the international community into distinct camps that transcended traditional alliance structures, creating new geopolitical alignments based on immediate strategic calculations rather than historical partnerships. Nations discovered that their responses to this crisis would influence diplomatic relationships and regional power balances for years beyond the immediate fighting. The speed and intensity of international polarization demonstrated how quickly modern conflicts can reshape global political dynamics, forcing governments to make choices that will define their international positions long after the current violence ends. These decisions have created a fundamentally altered diplomatic landscape where previous frameworks for regional cooperation and conflict resolution no longer apply to the realities that emerged from this escalation. The path forward, what 2025 means for regional stability. The task of rebuilding regional stability from this fundamentally altered foundation requires acknowledgement that traditional diplomatic approaches no longer match the operational realities created by advanced weapon systems and autonomous targeting capabilities. The Middle East security architecture that existed before January 2025 has collapsed, replaced by a fragmented landscape where established deterrence mechanisms cannot function when conflicts involve artificial intelligence, weapons that escalate faster than human decision-making processes can control. Regional powers face unprecedented challenges as they attempt to maintain stability while managing proxy forces equipped with technologies that exceed their own military capabilities. The Israel-Hamas deal that went into effect on January 19, 2025, presents opportunities for de-escalation through a pause in Israel's military campaign, the release of hostages, and the withdrawal of Israeli troops from parts of the Gaza Strip. However, the agreement's success remains uncertain, particularly given Iran's continued support for proxy forces who have vowed to continue fighting against Israel. The humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, with over 47,300 deaths and 1.9 million displaced people, creates conditions that make sustainable peace implementation extremely difficult. The total siege Israel imposed on the Strip since March 1, 2025, blocking all aid trucks for the first time since the war's early days, has exacerbated the humanitarian situation to crisis levels that require immediate international intervention. Intelligence sharing agreements between Arab nations and Israel have deteriorated beyond repair, eliminating early warning systems that previously prevented minor incidents from developing into major confrontations. Security cooperation that took decades to establish disappeared within months as domestic political pressures forced governments to choose between popular support and strategic partnerships. The technological capabilities demonstrated during 2025 created mutual fear that exceeds any previous period in the conflict's history, making trust-building measures that diplomats previously employed to create negotiating atmospheres impossible to implement effectively. The war has led to a surge in popular opposition from Arab publics to Arab-Israeli normalization, fundamentally altering the prospects for expanding the Abraham Accords. Saudi Arabia's insistence on progress toward Palestinian statehood has become a key factor determining future diplomatic relationships, while the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco face domestic pressure that complicates their existing agreements with Israel. The potential for normalization under current circumstances depends entirely on substantial progress toward resolving the Palestinian issue, creating diplomatic prerequisites that current conditions make extremely difficult to achieve. Regional power dynamics have shifted permanently as the conflict demonstrated that technological capabilities matter more than traditional military strength or economic resources. Iran's influence has expanded throughout the region as countries seek access to advanced weapon systems, while traditional alliance structures based on shared political interests have become less important than technological partnerships. The IDF's ground invasion of Lebanon following months of cross-border skirmishes with Hezbollah, combined with Houthi missile attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea and Iranian-backed attacks on U.S. military positions in Iraq and Syria, demonstrates how the conflict has exacerbated regional tensions across multiple fronts. Economic reconstruction requirements exceed the financial capabilities of both Israeli and Palestinian societies regardless of how current fighting eventually ends. Gaza requires complete infrastructure rebuilding that will consume enormous resources over many years, while Israeli border communities need comprehensive security upgrades and population relocation programs. The economic disruption extends throughout both societies as military spending priorities prevent investment in civilian infrastructure, education systems, and healthcare facilities. International reconstruction assistance faces political complications as donor nations demand oversight mechanisms that both sides view as threats to their sovereignty and security interests. The psychological and social trauma affecting both societies will influence political decision-making and social relationships for generations after active fighting ends. Israeli children growing up during 2025 experienced constant threat conditions that created anxiety disorders affecting their development, while Palestinian youth witnessed family members killed by precision weapons that appeared to select victims based on individual characteristics. These experiences create psychological profiles that favor military solutions over diplomatic compromise, making future peace negotiations more difficult as trauma survivors assume leadership positions within both societies. The absence of a regional authority capable of resolving conflicts and disputes has hindered stability efforts, making it difficult to anticipate peaceful resolution in the near term. The collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, along with the rise of non-state actors throughout the region, has further complicated attempts to establish effective mediation mechanisms. Without pragmatic restraint and renewed political will from all parties, regional stability will continue to be elusive as the cycle of violence requires new approaches that current political frameworks cannot accommodate. The precedents established during this conflict have created a new paradigm for Middle Eastern geopolitics that renders previous peace frameworks obsolete. The introduction of autonomous weapon systems and AI-guided targeting capabilities has created security environments where traditional negotiation assumptions no longer apply, forcing regional actors to confront realities that extend far beyond the immediate combat zones and will influence global security considerations for years to come. The 2025 escalation marks the end of conventional Middle Eastern warfare and the beginning of something far more dangerous. Advanced weapon systems and coordinated attacks have transformed regional conflict into a testing ground for technologies that blur the lines between combatants and civilians in ways that demand new rules of engagement and diplomacy. Military academies worldwide now study these battles as required curriculum because the tactics employed represent fundamental changes in how conflicts affect civilian populations. The integration of autonomous targeting systems with human decision-making has created challenges that require updated international norms and reaffirmation of humanitarian law. The June International Conference on the Two-State Solution represents a potential turning point for establishing diplomatic frameworks that address these new realities.